Martha's scream was lost in the roar of the storm as she swerved, the car spinning out of control. When everything stopped, she was deep in the woods, the car wrecked against a tree. The rain poured in through the shattered windows, the wind howled, and somewhere in the distance, a low, mournful cry echoed through the trees. Martha knew she wasn't alone. The forest was alive with whispers, the shadows teeming with unseen horrors. Her journey through the dark, both literal and metaphorical, had just begun. As she pushed the car door open, stepping into the unknown, her survival instincts took over. What awaited her in the shadowed depths of Eldritch Hollow's haunted woods? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: the horrors of this night were far from over. Martha's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the dense undergrowth of Eldritch Hollow's woods, her flashlight's beam swinging wildly through the towering trees. The storm raged above, a cacophony of thunder and whipping winds, the rain relentless, stinging her face like needles. She could feel the mud caking her shoes, weighing her down as she navigated the treacherous terrain. The woods of Eldritch Hollow were notorious for their ghostly tales, stories whispered around campfires, tales of lost souls and shadowy figures who roamed the forest, forever trapped in their nightmarish limbo. Martha had always scoffed at such tales, dismissing them as mere superstitions meant to scare children. But now, alone and terrified, she wasn't so sure. Her flashlight flickered, threatening to plunge her into darkness. She smacked it against her palm, praying it wouldn't die. As the light stabilized, it caught something, or someone, watching from between the trees. A silhouette, tall and thin, its eyes reflecting the light like those of a wild animal. Martha froze, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. The figure stood motionless, its gaze locked on her. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the dark underbrush. Pushing through her fear, Martha moved forward. She knew she had to keep moving. Standing still was not an option. The path, barely visible under the thick canopy, twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the forest. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made her jump. She was painfully aware of her vulnerability, the isolation of the woods amplifying her fear. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches like fingers reaching out to grab her. Martha's mind raced, every horror story she'd ever heard playing on a loop in her thoughts. She tried to calm herself, to focus on finding a way out, but panic was a cruel companion. A sudden movement to her right caught her attention. She swung the flashlight toward it, catching the briefest glimpse of something scurrying away. It was too large to be an animal, too agile to be human. Martha's breath caught in her throat. What was this place? What had she stumbled into? As she continued, the forest seemed to grow denser, the trees older, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The air grew colder, a chill that seeped into her bones. Martha wrapped her arms around herself, trying to preserve her body heat. The sound of the rain and wind was now accompanied by another sound, a soft, melodic humming. It was faint, almost imperceptible against the storm, but it was there, drawing her further into the woods. The humming grew louder, a haunting melody that seemed to resonate with the very air around her. Martha followed it, her curiosity overpowering her fear. The melody led her to a clearing where the moonlight, breaking through the clouds, illuminated a circle of stones. In the center of the circle stood a figure, cloaked in black, its face hidden beneath a hood. Martha stopped at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding. The figure turned slowly to face her, and as it did, the humming stopped. There was a moment of silence, a breathless, terrifying pause, and then the figure spoke. Its voice was soft, yet it carried across the clearing with unnerving clarity. "Lost souls wander not by chance," it said, its tone both mournful and menacing. Martha's voice trembled as she responded, "Who are you? What is this place?" The figure took a step toward her, the moonlight falling upon its face. What Martha saw made her gasp. The face was not human, not entirely. It was distorted, ethereal, as if woven from the shadows and the mist. "This is the realm of those caught between," the figure replied, "a limbo for those with unfinished business, and now you are part of it." Fear clenched at Martha's stomach. "Why am I here? I don't belong here." The figure chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Martha's spine. "Yet here you are. But fret not, you may still find your way back. Or you may choose to stay and become one with the forest." The choice chilled Martha to the bone. To stay would mean to lose herself forever, to become another tale whispered in the dark. She needed to escape, to get back to the world she knew. But how? As if reading her thoughts, the figure pointed toward a narrow path that led out of the clearing. "That way leads back to your world, but be warned, the journey is perilous, and many who attempt it lose more than their way." Martha nodded, her decision made. She would take her chances, face whatever horrors lay ahead. She stepped toward the path, her flashlight gripped tightly in her hand, her resolve steeling her against the unknown terrors that awaited her. The figure watched her go, its ominous words echoing in her mind. With each step, Martha felt the oppressive weight of the forest bearing down on her. The path was fraught with shadows that moved and whispered, each step a test of her courage. The rain continued to fall, relentless, as if trying to wash her away with it. Yet, she pressed on, determined to escape the haunting embrace of Eldritch Hollow. Martha's journey through the narrow path was tortuous and winding. Every step forward was a battle against the mud that clung greedily to her boots and the fear that clutched relentlessly at her heart. The woods seemed alive, aware of her every move, the trees bent low, as if whispering secrets to one another, their branches scratching at her face and arms like the fingers of the dead. As she pushed through a particularly dense thicket, her flashlight beam caught something hanging from a low branch, a doll, its face twisted in a permanent scream, its eye sockets empty and dark. The sight sent a shiver down her spine, and she quickly averted her eyes, trying to ignore the chilling laughter that bubbled up from somewhere deep within the woods. The path soon opened up onto a small creek, its waters swollen from the rain. The sound of the water rushing over rocks should have been soothing, but there was a dissonance to it, a whispering that didn't seem quite natural. As she neared the edge of the water, the mud gave way beneath her feet, and she slipped, tumbling into the icy cold stream. The water enveloped her, pulling her under momentarily. Gasping for air, she managed to pull herself to the bank, her clothes heavy and soaked through, her body trembling from cold and fear. It was then that she heard it, a low growl that seemed to come from all around her. Panicked, she scanned her surroundings with her flashlight. The light flickered, then steadied, revealing the eyes of a creature lurking just beyond the tree line. It was large, much larger than any normal animal of the woods, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Martha knew she couldn't outrun it. Her only chance was to keep moving and hope to find her way out of this nightmare. Stumbling to her feet, she hurried along the bank of the creek, her eyes darting everywhere, the growl of the creature a constant companion. The trees began to thin, and she found herself on a broader path, one that seemed more traveled, the ground trampled and bare in places. Hope flickered in her chest. Perhaps this path would lead her out of the forest, back to civilization, to safety. But the forest was not done with her yet. As she rounded a bend, the path was blocked by a figure, tall and imposing, its features obscured by the dark. Martha stopped dead in her tracks, her heart racing. The figure stepped forward, and the moonlight fell upon its face. It was not the face of a human or any creature she had ever seen. It was as if the very shadows had molded themselves into a visage of terror, eyes deep in endless pits of despair. "Why do you flee?" the figure asked, its voice a cold whisper that seemed to wrap itself around her. "The forest embraces all who enter, willingly or not." "I don't belong here," Martha replied, her voice barely above a whisper, her body tensed for any opportunity to escape. "None of us did, once," the figure said, stepping aside, allowing her to see that the path continued beyond it. "But the forest claims what it wills." Martha took a hesitant step forward, then another, her eyes locked on the figure. It made no move to stop her. Instead, it simply watched, a silent sentinel. As she passed it, a coldness enveloped her, a darkness that seemed to seep into her bones. The path now sloped upward, leading her to a ridge that overlooked the valley below. The sight of the town in the distance brought tears to her eyes. But between her and safety lay the thickest part of the forest yet, a dark patch where the trees grew so dense that not even the moonlight penetrated. As she descended into the valley, the darkness grew oppressive, tangible, as if she could reach out and touch it. Sounds were muffled here, the silence complete, a void where her own breathing seemed sacrilegious. She kept her flashlight off, fearing it would attract whatever horrors lay waiting in the shadows. Suddenly, a light appeared in the distance, not the flickering of a flashlight or the steady glow of a lamp, but something otherworldly, pulsing and bright. Drawn to it, despite her fear, Martha moved toward the light, each step cautious, her senses alert. The light grew stronger, illuminating a small clearing in the heart of the darkness. In the center of the clearing was a pond, its waters still and mirror-like. Floating just above the surface was the source of the light, a sphere, translucent and shimmering, pulsating with a life of its own. Martha stepped into the clearing, her gaze fixed on the mesmerizing light. As she approached the pond, the sphere seemed to react, its pulsations quickening, its light intensifying. She reached out a hand, compelled by a force she couldn't resist. Just then, a scream shattered the night, high-pitched and terrifying, cutting through the silence like a knife. Martha whipped around, her heart in her throat. The light from the sphere flickered, then went out, plunging her into darkness so complete, so absolute, she couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. The scream came again, closer this time, desperate and chilling. Martha knew she should run, flee this cursed place, but her feet were rooted to the spot, her body trembling uncontrollably. In the pitch black of the forest clearing, Martha's senses sharpened to the raw edge of terror. The screams continued, echoing through the trees, each cry more agonized and haunting than the last. Frozen in place, she could only shudder as the chilling sounds seemed to encircle her, coming from every direction, converging upon her solitary figure in the dark. Her mind raced, panic surged like wildfire through her veins. Each scream felt as if it were clawing its way inside her, lodging itself deep within her soul. The darkness was oppressive, a tangible force that weighed heavily on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. The silence that followed each scream was perhaps even more terrifying. It was thick, expectant, filled with unseen threats lurking just beyond the reach of perception. The sudden return of the mysterious light broke the oppressive cycle. The sphere above the pond flickered back to life, its glow steady now, bathing the clearing in an eerie, soft luminescence. The light seemed to pulse in rhythm with Martha's rapid heartbeat, its shimmering surface drawing her gaze once more. Despite the terror that gripped her, curiosity burned within her, a desperate need to understand this phenomenon, to find some answers that might lead her out of this nightmare. With cautious steps, she approached the pond once again, her eyes never leaving the glowing sphere. As she drew closer, the air around her seemed to vibrate with a silent hum, a frequency felt rather than heard. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers inching toward the light, drawn by its mesmerizing dance. Just as her fingertips were about to brush against the surface of the sphere, a violent gust of wind swept through the clearing, whipping her hair and clothes into a wild frenzy. The sphere quivered, then shot upwards into the sky, disappearing from sight in an instant. The light it had cast was gone, plunging her back into darkness, but this time, a faint glow from the moon provided a silver lining of visibility. Heart pounding, Martha turned back to the path she had been following, only to find that it had changed. The trees seemed to have closed in, the path narrower and more rugged than before. With no other choice, she pressed on, each step an active against the fear that sought to paralyze her. As she navigated through the twisted trees, the ground beneath her feet began to feel uneven, softer, as if it were slowly giving way. A thick fog began to roll in, swirling around her legs, creeping forward until it enveloped her entirely, obscuring her vision and dampening the sounds of the forest. She could no longer see the path, only feel it under her uncertain steps. Suddenly, her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, catching herself just before she fell face first into the muddy earth. As she regained her footing, her hand brushed against something solid yet oddly smooth. Pointing her flashlight downward, her breath caught in her throat when the light revealed a half-buried stone with engravings that glowed faintly with a phosphorescent light. The markings were strange, unlike any language she knew, their curves and slashes seeming to writhe under her gaze. Hesitant yet compelled, Martha cleared more of the mud away, revealing more of the stone. It was larger than she had first thought, oval-shaped, and completely covered in the glowing markings. The realization dawned on her that she might have stumbled upon something ancient, something significant. Her contemplation was abruptly interrupted by a soft whispering sound, like voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. The voices grew in intensity, a cacophonous symphony of whispers that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. She leaned closer, trying to discern any comprehensible words, but the voices eluded clarity, slipping through her mind like water through fingers. In the pitch black of the forest clearing, Martha's senses sharpened to the raw edge of terror. The screams continued, echoing through the trees, each cry more agonized and haunting than the last. Frozen in place, she could only shudder as the chilling sound seemed to encircle her, coming from every direction, converging upon her solitary figure in the dark. Her mind raced, panic surged like wildfire through her veins. Each scream felt as if it were clawing its way inside her, lodging itself deep within her soul. The darkness was oppressive, a tangible force that weighed heavily on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. The silence that followed each scream was perhaps even more terrifying. It was thick, expectant, filled with unseen threats lurking just beyond the reach of perception. The sudden return of the mysterious light broke the oppressive cycle. The sphere above the pond flickered back to life, its glow steady now, bathing the clearing in an eerie, soft luminescence. The light seemed to pulse in rhythm with Martha's rapid heartbeat, its shimmering surface drawing her gaze once more. Despite the terror that gripped her, curiosity burned within her, a desperate need to understand this phenomenon, to find some answers that might lead her out of this nightmare. With cautious steps, she approached the pond once again, her eyes never leaving the glowing sphere. As she drew closer, the air around her seemed to vibrate with a silent hum, a frequency felt rather than heard. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers inching toward the light, drawn by its mesmerizing dance. Just as her fingertips were about to brush against the surface of the sphere, a violent gust of wind swept through the clearing, whipping her hair and clothes into a wild frenzy. The sphere quivered, then shot upwards into the sky, disappearing from sight in an instant. The light it had cast was gone, plunging her back into darkness, but this time, a faint glow from the moon provided a silver lining of visibility. Heart pounding, Martha turned back to the path she had been following, only to find that it had changed. The trees seemed to have closed in, the path narrower and more rugged than before. With no other choice, she pressed on, each step an actival against the fear that sought to paralyze her. As she navigated through the twisted trees, the ground beneath her feet began to feel uneven, softer, as if it were slowly giving way. A thick fog began to roll in, swirling around her legs, creeping forward until it enveloped her entirely, obscuring her vision and dampening the sounds of the forest. She could no longer see the path, only feel it under her uncertain steps. Suddenly, her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, catching herself just before she fell face first into the muddy earth. As she regained her footing, her hand brushed against something solid yet oddly smooth. Pointing her flashlight downward, her breath caught in her throat when the light revealed a half-buried stone with engravings that glowed faintly with a phosphorescent light. The markings were strange, unlike any language she knew, their curves and slashes seeming to writhe under her gaze. Hesitant yet compelled, Martha cleared more of the mud away, revealing more of the stone. It was larger than she had first thought, oval-shaped, and completely covered in the glowing markings. The realization dawned on her that she might have stumbled upon something ancient, something significant. Her contemplation was abruptly interrupted by a soft whispering sound, like voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. The voices grew in intensity, a cacophonous symphony of whispers that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. She leaned closer, trying to discern any comprehensible words, but the voices eluded clarity, slipping through her mind like water through fingers. The fog thickened around her, the air chilling as the temperature dropped rapidly. The whispers turned to moans, the sounds of torment and despair that twisted in the air, palpable in their suffering. Martha recoiled, her heart racing as she realized that she was not alone. Figures began to materialize within the fog, their forms vague and shifting, faces contorted in agony. Terrified, Martha backed away from the stone, her eyes wide as the figures approached. Each step backward was a struggle, the fog seeming to resist her, thickening with her every breath. She turned to flee, but her movements were slow, the fog clinging to her like a second skin, dragging her down. The spectral figures inched closer, their forms now more distinct, more horrifying. Each wore expressions of eternal torment, their mouths agape in silent screams, eyes hollow and filled with an unspoken dread. The air grew colder still, the breaths Martha took felt like inhaling shards of ice. Each breath was a struggle, each moment stretched out into what seemed an eternity of fear. Martha's back hit the trunk of a large tree, its rough bark scratched against her skin through her soaked clothes. Trapped, with nowhere to run, she slid down to the ground, her eyes never leaving the advancing horrors. The figures paused as if sensing her resignation, then slowly, they began to dissolve into the mist, their forms breaking apart like sand castles washed away by the tide. Breathing heavily, Martha closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart, to assert some semblance of control over her frayed nerves. When she opened them again, the fog was beginning to lift, the oppressive atmosphere lightening slightly as if the forest itself had taken a deep, cleansing breath. Though the immediate threat had passed, the forest remained a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. The moon, now clear of cloud cover, cast a silvery glow that seemed to guide her, beckoning her to rise and continue. Her limbs stiff from fear and cold, Martha pushed herself up, using the tree for support, and resumed her trek, her resolve hardened by the horrors she had faced. As she walked, her mind replayed the night's terrors, trying to make sense of what she had encountered. The haunted figures, the mysterious stone, the sphere of light, all elements of a nightmare, yet undeniably real in their consequences. The path ahead seemed endless, winding through the ancient trees, each step taking her deeper into the unknown. Suddenly, a sharp noise pierced the night, a crack like thunder, but more immediate, more violent. Martha froze, her senses on high alert. A large branch snapped from a tree to her right, crashing down mere feet in front of her, blocking her path. Heart pounding, she looked up, scanning the tree line, expecting to see some monstrous entity responsible for the disruption. Instead, there was only the wind, howling mournfully through the trees, its voice full of sorrow and warning. Circling around the fallen branch, Martha continued, her pace quickened by a new surge of adrenaline. The path began to slope downward, leading into a narrow valley. The trees here were older, their trunks massive, roots sprawling across the forest floor like the sinewy limbs of giants. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting only slivers of light that flickered with the swaying branches. As she descended, a sound different from the wind caught her attention, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat. It grew louder, more insistent as she approached the base of the valley. Her flashlight flickered, its beam stuttering over a small cabin nestled against the far side of the valley. The cabin was old, its wood weathered and gray, windows dark, the whole structure exuding an aura of abandonment. Despite every instinct screaming at her to turn back, Martha's feet carried her forward, drawn by the thumping, which she could now hear clearly emanating from inside the cabin. She reached the door, its surface rough and splintered, a rusty doorknob inviting yet foreboding. Taking a deep breath, she grasped the knob, turned it, and pushed the door open. Inside, the cabin was shrouded in shadows, the only light coming from the cracks in the wood where the moonlight seeped through. The thumping was louder now, so loud it seemed to echo off the walls, filling the space with its ominous beat. Martha stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room, revealing little in the way of furnishings, a broken table, a couple of chairs, and an old fireplace blackened by years of use. Then, her light fell upon the source of the sound. In the center of the room, a large book lay open on a pedestal, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze, though the air inside the cabin was still. The pages turned on their own, stopping on a page filled with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Drawn to it, Martha approached the book, each step hesitant. She leaned over to get a better look at the page, trying to decipher the glowing symbols. As she did, the air around her grew colder, the shadows darker. The cabin seemed to close in around her, the walls creaking, the floorboards groaning under her weight. And then, the voices started again, whispering from the corners of the room, from the very air itself. They were clearer now, not just murmurs but distinct words, though in a language she could not understand. They swirled around her, fast and urgent, as if conveying a warning, a prophecy, a spell. Martha, her mind racing, her body tense, knew she was standing on the brink of something profound and terrifying. She could feel the history of the cabin, the forest, and the book converging, reaching out to her through the shadows, beckoning her deeper into their mysteries. The whispers intensified, the words twisting and turning around her, enveloping Martha in a cacophony of eerie chants. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing symbols on the page, which seemed to pulsate with a life of their own. A deep dread settled over her, yet she was transfixed, unable to tear her gaze away from the ancient script. The air in the cabin thickened, heavy with the weight of unseen presences, and the temperature dropped further, her breath now visible in puffs of white. Martha reached out a trembling hand towards the book, her fingers inching closer to the ancient pages. As soon as her skin made contact, a jolt of energy surged through her, knocking her back. She stumbled, nearly falling but catching herself against the rough wall of the cabin. The room spun around her, the walls seeming to breathe in sync with the ominous thumping that now filled the air. Gasping for breath, she steadied herself, her mind reeling from the encounter. The book seemed to beckon her, its pages fluttering as if calling her to return. With every ounce of courage she could muster, Martha approached the book once more, this time wary of touching it. She studied the symbols, their design both mesmerizing and menacing. As she observed, the pages began to turn again, slowly at first, then picking up speed. They stopped abruptly on a new page, this one featuring a detailed drawing of the very cabin she stood in, surrounded by the dense forest. The detail was incredible, every line and shadow meticulously drawn, as if the artist had captured the essence of the place under the glow of a full moon. The cabin around her seemed to respond to the page turning, the air vibrating with energy. Martha felt a pull, a literal tug in her gut that directed her to look outside through one of the cabin's small, grimy windows. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. Figures were moving in the shadows, their forms vague and shifting, circling the cabin like predators stalking their prey. Panic surged through her veins, and Martha knew she needed to leave before whatever was out there found its way in. As she turned towards the door, however, the cabin began to change. The walls creaked louder, the floorboards shifted beneath her feet, and the shadows seemed to stretch towards her, grasping, clawing with tendrils of darkness. Her flashlight flickered violently, struggling against the overwhelming darkness that was now consuming the cabin. Just as it was about to go out, a loud snap echoed through the room, and the beam of light stabilized, cutting through the darkness with renewed vigor. Martha took advantage of this momentary reprieve, making a dash for the door. As she reached for the handle, a cold hand gripped her wrist. She screamed, whipping around, her flashlight beam landing on the figure that had caught her. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow sockets of despair. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, as if a volume dial had been turned up, her voice came through, hoarse and whispering, "Do not leave, the book, It must not be. Before she could finish, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving Martha alone once more. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hand ached where the ghostly woman had gripped her. With no time to ponder the meaning of the woman's words, Martha flung the door open and stepped out into the night. The forest greeted her with its chorus of night sounds, but over it all, she could hear the faint thumping still emanating from the cabin behind her. She didn't dare look back, her mind set only on escaping the nightmare she had stumbled into. The path that had led her here was barely visible, but instinct guided her steps as she began to run, the cold air burning her lungs, her legs pushing as hard as they could against the soft earth. Branches whipped against her face, and roots threatened to trip her at every step, but fear propelled her forward. She could feel the forest alive around her, the darkness pulsing with a malevolent energy, as if the whole place was aware of her escape attempt and disapproved. Martha's breaths were labored, each inhalation sharp against the cool air. Her body felt like it was at its limit, but she dared not stop. Behind her, the thumping sound continued, a relentless reminder of the horrors that lingered just beyond sight. Her flashlight flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced along the path, morphing into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out for her. The forest seemed endless, the trees towering menacingly above, their branches gnarled like the hands of the damned, grasping at the sliver of light from her flashlight. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, sent shockwaves of fear through her spine, her imagination conjuring up all sorts of fiends lurking in the darkness. Suddenly, a sharp howl split the night, echoing through the trees, its origin unclear, but undeniably close. The sound was primal, a mixture of pain and rage, a sound that no human could produce. Martha's pace quickened, her feet barely touching the ground as she darted forward, the cold air stinging her eyes, causing tears to stream down her face. Ahead, the path forked, a decision point she was unprepared for. To her left, the trail led deeper into the denser part of the forest, where the trees were so thickly packed that daylight probably never touched the ground. To her right, the path sloped downward, leading towards what looked like a narrow ravine, bordered by towering rock faces that disappeared into the darkness. Without hesitating too long, she chose the right-hand path, hoping it would lead her out of the forest and back towards some semblance of civilization, or at least away from the immediate threats that seemed to be closing in on her from all sides. As she descended, the terrain became rocky, the ground uneven, making her footing precarious. She slowed her pace, picking her way carefully, her hands brushing against the cold, damp rocks for balance. The howling followed her, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close, a constant pursuit that drove her onward. Her flashlight beam swept across something unusual, causing her to stop abruptly. There, on one of the rocks, was a carving, much like the symbols she had seen in the book back in the cabin. The lines were deeply etched into the stone, glowing faintly with an unnatural light that did not flicker like her flashlight but remained steady, illuminating the symbols clearly. Drawn to the carving, she leaned closer, her mind racing to connect this discovery with what she had experienced in the cabin. The symbols seemed to pulse as she studied them, their glow intensifying as if reacting to her presence. A cold breeze swept through the ravine, carrying with it whispers, the same indistinct, murmuring voices she had heard before, but now they seemed to emanate from the glowing symbols. Frightened yet fascinated, Martha reached out to trace the symbols with her fingers, half expecting another surge of energy like before. Instead, the stone was cold, incredibly cold, as if it had been chilled to the core. The moment her skin made contact with the symbols, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They swirled around her, words in a language she could not understand, yet they carried a message that felt urgent, desperate. She pulled her hand back, the cold from the stone lingering on her fingertips, spreading up her arm. The ravine seemed to close in around her, the rock faces looming, the path narrowing. She turned to continue her descent, her heart pounding in her chest, the whispers echoing in her ears. The path became steeper, the rocks more jagged, and every step required her full concentration. As she navigated the treacherous path, a sudden movement caught her eye. Something large shifted in the shadows, its form obscured by the darkness. She stopped, holding her breath, her flashlight aimed at the spot where she had seen the movement. Her hand trembled, the beam of light shaking, casting erratic shadows on the rocks. Then, silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that felt like a blanket thrown over the world. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Martha felt a chill run down her spine, her instinct screaming at her to flee, to escape whatever was watching her from within the shadows. Martha's heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the creature that had stirred in the shadows. The oppressive silence hung thick in the air, every sound magnified, a distant drop of water echoing like a drum, her own breathing harsh and ragged in her ears. The tension was palpable, a tangible thread stretched to its breaking point. Slowly, cautiously, she began to move forward again, her footsteps deliberate and soft on the rough terrain. The beam of her flashlight trembled as she swept it back and forth, the light slicing through the suffocating darkness, revealing only more jagged rocks and the gnarled roots of thirsty trees. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. As she rounded a sharp bend in the ravine, the path suddenly opened up into a wider area, the moonlight breaking through the dense canopy above to reveal a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering cliffs. In the center, a large, flat stone sat, almost altar-like in its appearance. The moonlight illuminated intricate carvings on its surface, similar to the ones she had seen earlier, but far more elaborate and sinister. Martha's approach was slow, her senses on high alert. The carvings on the stone pulsed with a cold light, casting eerie shadows around the clearing. She could feel a pull, an almost magnetic draw to the stone. It was as if the whispers she had heard earlier were emanating from it, calling to her, beckoning her closer with promises of secrets long buried. Compelled by a force she couldn't resist, Martha stepped closer to the stone, her eyes locked on the hypnotic carvings. The air around her grew colder, the atmosphere charged with a static energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The ground beneath her feet vibrated subtly, a tremor that seemed to spread through the clearing. Just as she reached the stone, the ground shook violently, throwing her off balance. She stumbled, catching herself just before she could fall onto the carved surface. The earth continued to rumble, the tremors growing in intensity, as if something deep below was trying to break free. Above, the sky seemed to react, clouds swirling into a vortex directly above the clearing, the moon's light casting an otherworldly glow on the scene. Martha, overwhelmed by the power of the moment, felt a deep, primal fear rise within her, a fear not just for her safety, but for her very soul. Then, from the shadows around the clearing, figures began to emerge. Not the spectral, tormented souls she had seen before, but hooded figures, solid and real, their faces obscured by darkness. They moved silently, forming a circle around the stone, their presence oppressive, heavy with malevolence. Martha, trapped within the circle, watched in horror as one of the figures stepped forward, reaching into the folds of its robe. It withdrew a small, ornately carved box and placed it gently on the stone. The carvings on the box glowed with the same eerie light as those on the stone, and as it made contact, a loud, piercing sound filled the air, a cry that seemed to come from the earth itself. The figures began to chant, their voices low and harmonious, weaving through the air like a dark melody. The ground stopped shaking, but the air remained thick with the power of their words, the atmosphere pulsing with energy. Martha, caught in the eye of this supernatural storm, felt a clarity descend upon her. She understood now that she was witnessing something ancient, a ritual that was part of the very fabric of Eldritch Hollow's dark history. She knew she could not stop it, but perhaps she could survive it. Gathering every shred of courage, she prepared herself to make a break for freedom at the next opportunity. Her mind raced, plotting her escape, even as the ritual reached its climax, the chanting reaching a fever pitch. Martha's heart pounded in her chest as the chanting grew louder, the sound vibrating through the air and resonating deep within her bones. The hooded figures continued their ritual, their voices merging into a single, haunting melody that seemed to call forth something ancient and powerful. The carvings on the stone glowed brighter, the light pulsing in time with the chant. Desperation clawed at her mind as she scanned the clearing for any means of escape. The figures had formed a tight circle, their attention focused entirely on the stone and the box. She edged backward, hoping to find a gap in their formation, but they were too closely packed, their presence impenetrable. Suddenly, a figure in the center of the circle raised its hands, and the chanting ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, an oppressive weight that pressed down on Martha's chest, making it hard to breathe. The figure opened the box, and a blinding light erupted from within, casting sharp shadows and illuminating the clearing in an otherworldly glow. Martha shielded her eyes, squinting against the brilliance. As her vision adjusted, she saw something emerging from the box, a shape, amorphous and shifting, coalescing into a form that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. It was a creature of pure darkness, its eyes glowing with an inner fire, its body writhing like smoke caught in a windstorm. The creature's gaze locked onto Martha, and she felt a cold dread wash over her. The hooded figures began to chant again, their voices a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to command the creature. It moved toward her, gliding across the ground, its form flickering and unstable. Panicking, Martha scrambled backward, but the creature was relentless, its advance unstoppable. As it loomed over her, she felt an icy tendril of its essence brush against her skin, sending a shock of terror through her body. She screamed, the sound lost in the oppressive hum of the chant. In that moment of sheer terror, something within Martha snapped. A fierce determination surged through her veins, a primal will to survive. She grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the creature. The rock passed through it harmlessly, but the act broke the creature's focus. It hesitated, its form flickering, and the chanting faltered. Seizing the moment, Martha leaped to her feet and dashed toward the edge of the clearing. The hooded figures reached out to stop her, but she was too quick, slipping through their grasp and plunging into the dense forest. Branches whipped against her face, the ground uneven and treacherous, but she kept running, fueled by pure adrenaline. Behind her, the chanting grew chaotic, the ritual disrupted by her escape. The creature's roar of anger echoed through the trees, a sound of pure malevolence that spurred her on. She could hear the figures pursuing her, their footsteps heavy and relentless, but she did not look back. The forest seemed to blur around her as she ran, her focus narrowing to the path ahead. She burst through the trees and found herself on a narrow trail that wound up a steep hill. She scrambled up the incline, her hands and knees scraping against the rough ground, every muscle in her body burning with effort. At the top of the hill, she paused to catch her breath, glancing back to see if she was still being pursued. The forest below was dark and silent, the figures lost in the shadows, but she knew they would not give up so easily. She turned and continued running, the path leading her toward a faint light in the distance. As she drew closer, she realized the light was coming from a small cabin, its windows glowing warmly in the night. She stumbled toward it, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. She reached the door and pounded on it, her fists sore and bleeding. "Please, help me," she cried, her voice hoarse and desperate. The door creaked open, and an elderly woman stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with concern. Without a word, she pulled Martha inside and shut the door, bolting it securely. The interior of the cabin was cozy and inviting, a stark contrast to the horrors of the forest outside. Martha collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The woman knelt beside her, offering a cup of hot tea. "Drink this, child. It will calm your nerves." Martha accepted the cup with shaking hands, the warmth of the tea seeping into her bones. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman nodded, her expression kind but serious. "You are safe here, but you must tell me what happened. The forest is not kind to those who wander uninvited." Martha took a deep breath, recounting her ordeal, the words tumbling out in a rush. The woman listened intently, her face growing grimmer with each detail. When Martha finished, the woman sighed. "You have encountered an ancient evil, one that has plagued this forest for centuries. The ritual you disrupted was meant to bind the creature, but now it is free, and it will seek you out. Fear tightened around Martha's heart. What can I do? How do I stop it? The woman stood and retrieved a small, intricately carved box from a shelf. This is a relic of protection, passed down through generations. It will shield you from the creature's power, but it is not foolproof. You must confront it, face it with all the courage you can muster, and send it back to the darkness from whence it came. Martha took the box, its weight comforting in her hands. How do I do that? The woman placed a hand on her shoulder. You must return to the clearing, finish the ritual, and bind the creature once more. It will be dangerous, but it is the only way. Martha nodded, a newfound determination settling over her. She knew what she had to do. She would face the darkness, confront her fears, and end the nightmare once and for all. As she left the safety of the cabin, the night seemed darker, the forest more menacing. But she walked with purpose, the relic clutched tightly in her hand. She retraced her steps, the path familiar yet foreboding, each step bringing her closer to the clearing where it had all begun. When she arrived, the hooded figures were waiting, their faces hidden in the shadows, the creature writhing at their center, its eyes burning with hatred. The chanting resumed, a discordant harmony that filled the air with dread. Martha stepped into the circle, her voice steady as she began to speak the words she had learned, the relic glowing with a brilliant light. The creature roared, its form twisting and contorting, but she stood firm, her voice unwavering. The ground trembled beneath her feet, the air crackling with energy. The hooded figures raised their arms, their voices joining hers in a powerful crescendo. The light from the relic intensified, engulfing the creature in a blinding blaze. It screamed, a sound of pure anguish, as its form dissolved into the light, vanished back to the darkness. As the last echoes of the chant faded, the clearing fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. Martha stood alone, the hooded figures gone, the relic still glowing softly in her hand. She took a deep breath, relief flooding through her. The nightmare was over, the creature defeated. But as she turned to leave, a whisper of a thought crossed her mind. Darkness never truly disappears. It merely retreats, waiting for the next opportunity to emerge. And as she walked back through the forest, the shadows seemed to watch her, a silent reminder that some evils never truly die. As she emerged from the woods, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the world in a soft, golden glow. She had survived the night, faced her fears, and emerged stronger. But the memory of the darkness would stay with her, a haunting reminder of the battle she had fought and won. Martha knew she would never be the same, the shadows of Eldridge Hollow forever etched into her soul. But she also knew she was no longer afraid. She had faced the darkness and prevailed. And though the forest would always hold its secrets, she had found her strength within its depths, a strength that would carry her through whatever lay ahead. The end, yet not quite. For in Eldritch Hollow, shadows linger, and whispers carry tales of those who dare to challenge the darkness. Martha's story would join the others, a legend of courage and survival, a beacon of light in a world forever touched by shadow.